So speaking of your, that this move that you guys have done to release your stories with a journalistic perspective, you had another story other than just the advisory board break this week.
Yeah.
What can you tell us about that? I've shared the screen now so you can see the article
Yeah.
that we have.
Yeah, man, this was a rough one. If any of your listeners haven't read this, they need to. It's an important article. It's hard to read. I mean, trigger warning up and down, left and right. And it's about a case of sex abuse against children that not only involves some horrific acts that were performed on these children, but these acts were filmed and distributed on the internet. And so, I mean, massive trigger warning. We kept the worst details out of the article, but we also published the public documents, the court records, and there are some graphic depictions. So just buyer beware on that. But basically, what happened was there was a guy. He was a border patrol agent actually in a small border town in Arizona, and in 2015 or not 2015 in either 2010 or 11, it's not clear which year. His wife said 2010, the bishop said 2011. They were both going on memory like 6 years later, so I think that neither one of them know the exact date. But 2010 or 2011, he confesses to his bishop, John Herod, who was happened to be a doctor. I believe he still is a doctor in Bisbee, Arizona. He confessed to molesting his daughter, who at the time was about 6 years old, and filming it. He admitted to filming it and all this kind of stuff and all this child pornography and whatnot. The doctor, according to the court documents, the doctor calls in the wife and basically is like, hey, tell your wife what you just told me. I'm sort of paraphrasing, right?
Mm-hmm.
And it appears that one of the reasons why he did this is because he was hoping that the wife would do whatever she needed to do to protect these kids, leave town, call the cops, type of thing. And I think to his surprise, he doesn't, I don't believe he said to his surprise, but it kind of is implied. She had no reaction. Like, it was almost as if this was not a surprise to her, this revelation. And she did tell the bishop that she would, do what she needed to do to keep her daughter away from him. And this is his daughter too, by the way. This is not his stepdaughter. This is his biological daughter.
Yeah.
And the bishop called the hotline, of course, as they're instructed to do up in Salt Lake City.
Yeah.
And the hotline, according to the court documents, the hotline instructed him to not notify the police and to just continue one-on-one counseling sessions with him. And so the bishop did do that. And again, this is all in the court documents. If anybody, that doesn't believe what I'm saying, they can go read it for themselves.
So just to stop at this particular moment, what you're talking about is a member of a congregation who's been abusing a child, his child, filming it and distributing it. So that part is, no institution is going to be able to do that. The institution is not responsible for that. That is a crime that is occurring. Okay, so then a confession happens where now the institution is brought on board. And so now we have a bishop who is both a clergy and a doctor. And I want to get into that because as a physician myself, who has been through some of the training that physicians go through in terms of what our obligations as physicians are to society, there's mixed obligations in the role of that doctor there. But so he receives this confession. He knows that something, well, he should understand that it's criminal is happening. He, rather than making the decision himself as to whether or not to turn this person over to the authorities, he abrogates that responsibility to the attorneys of the church, asking them, what should I do? And the attorneys of the church now, Kurt and McConkie, say, well, and correct me if I'm wrong, but this is church policy and it's ongoing, which is that if you are in a state where your clergy have an exemption from the obligation to report abuse, then the church instructs its representatives, its bishops, its local level leaders not to get involved, not to report it. and instead treat it as a repentance issue, and that's what we're seeing happen here. So what I want to focus on really is just kind of the institutional aspect of that. I think the crime itself and the person itself are really secondary to that for the purposes of what the center of the news story is here.
Yeah, and you're correct on describing the way the church operates. And a little really quick sidebar, because I've seen a lot of comments in reaction to this story about people pointing, saying, oh, well, look, the church did the right thing recently in Oregon, because there's a story out of Oregon, I'm not going to get into it, where it appears that the church, a bishop against the Oregon law, because in Oregon they have the same sort of privilege thing, went to all I want to say on that story is people should withhold their praise. We're working on looking into that story. I can't report anything yet, but I can say that I think when all the chips fall, it's going to be very likely that abuse up in Oregon got reported not because the church directed people to. But so I would just say withhold judgment on that one. But going back to this Arizona case, this bishop is now basically on notice. And one of the interesting things that I found, and I don't want to, not to minimize other types of abuse or anything like that, but I suppose if one is trying to argue on behalf of the church, they could say, well, if somebody comes in and says, a year ago I did this thing and it was a big mistake and I feel horrible about it and it's not happening anymore, right? Some sort of like past crime, as I still think it should be reported, but again, maybe the church can make some sort of an argument that, hey, he's moving forward, he's repenting, he's trying to do the right thing, whatever. But in this case, the court documents reveal that over the course of several years, that this guy was meeting regularly with the bishop, and sometimes his wife was in those meetings, and sometimes she wasn't. He was confessing to having continued to do these acts. So this is a case where he was not only confessing to a crime, but confessing to the fact that he was ongoing in this crime. Now, as if it couldn't get worse. Now, at some point, he gets excommunicated. It's unclear exactly when. So we don't know if it was like early on in the confession or if it was several years later. But he was at some point excommunicated for what he did to his daughters. Now, a point of clarification, because some people who have read the documents, the very first document that you read, the first hearing document that you read, it seems to say that he was excommunicated for having sex with his mother. That's not true. What happened is his wife, when he later got arrested, which I'll get to in a second, and people were coming to her and asking her, well, is this why you got excommunicated? Because a lot of people knew he got excommunicated, but they didn't know why. And they're like, is this why he got excommunicated years ago? And even the police asked her in her initial interview, why was he excommunicated? And I guess as a way to deflect, I don't know why she did this, if maybe to try to make it seem like she didn't know about the abuse or what, she lied to people and said that he had gotten excommunicated for having sex with his mother. Okay, so that was not true.
That raises a bunch of questions, not so much that detail, but for viewers who may not understand this, when you get excommunicated as a priesthood holder, which this man presumably was, that's not just you meeting with your bishop who you've been confessing to. That means that there are 12 people, usually of upstanding character, high, professionals in the stake, who have all convened in an evening, and they've all had the evidence presented to them. And every single one of them now are brought into this circle of knowledge that there is a crime going on and that there are victims that continue to be subject to the things that we're talking about. Not a single one of these 12 people, in addition to the bishop, in addition to the stake presidency, not a single one of them felt like they were empowered to go to law enforcement. And we're seeing here kind of the symptoms of this culture that we have, where the church itself is above the law or is able to adjudicate things that should be crimes subject to legal enforcement and not sins subject to repentance.
Yeah, and then to just, as if the situation isn't bad enough, his wife gives birth to another daughter in 2015 after all of this is going on. And he does the exact same thing to her. They found videos of him doing all. I don't even want to say what he did. Listen, if you read these court documents and they go into graphic description of what he did on these videos, the lead investigator on this case, who is doing most of the describing in the court documents. He actually makes it a point. One of the attorneys says something to him like, how do you remember all of these details? How are you able to remember all these details if you haven't seen this video? And because at this point it's been years. They're years into this, and they're a couple of years into this investigation or whatever. How is it that you can remember what you saw? And he says something like, in the course of my career, I've seen thousands of these images and videos, unfortunately. And one of the ways we cope with it is that, they kind of blend together and they become kind of a blur in your head. And he said, this one was so bad, it was one of the worst cases I've ever seen that I can't get the images out of my head. This is one of the worst cases I've ever read about. This one of the worst cases he's ever seen in his career. So it's unbelievable. It's almost like you can't even believe some of this stuff is true. But so he ends up abusing his next daughter, who was basically an infant, because he was arrested when the daughter was like 18 months. So he was, abusing this baby basically, along with his other daughter. So finally, in 2017, a tip comes through the system, the legal system, because it's actually out of New Zealand. And I don't know what the circumstances were in New Zealand. I don't know if it was a police investigation or what, but some child pornography was found on a computer in New Zealand, and they were able to trace that child pornography, I assume through the metadata or something, back to this guy. And not only were they able to trace it back to him, but it was a video, and you could see his face clearly, apparently, on the video. So there was no question, right, as to whether or not who it was. Now, because he was a Border Patrol agent, and I guess this is common. I talked to some attorneys. This is apparently common when an employee of a federal agency commits a crime like this. That agency's investigative arm will head the investigation. So this tip was sent to ICE, which is the investigative arm of Homeland Security. And ICE headed the investigation. They acted very quickly. The exact same day they received the video, they got a search warrant. And they raided the house. The guy was at work that day, and so they went to his Border Patrol headquarters where he was at. They interviewed him there. They interviewed the wife at the house. They seized thousands of images and videos. And in that interview, the guy confesses to everything. I mean, he couldn't deny it. Obviously, his face is on the video. So he actually admits to the investigators in that initial interview that, yes, I did all these things and I am doing all these things. And he was arrested on the spot, of course. The wife was not initially arrested, but later they really felt that the evidence was overwhelming, that she knew what was going on, and it is. And so she was also charged. Now, he committed suicide in custody before his case could be adjudicated. So he was never officially found guilty. He was never, sentenced. Obviously, it was going to happen. I think he was facing, there were like 8 counts that we published. I think there were actually more additional counts later on that we didn't get that document. But
so looking at the story that you've described from the institutional perspective,
yeah,
I think there's a phenomenon that, Bill, as a former bishop, you can probably speak to, and that is that when people confess things, they tend to minimize the true extent of what they're confessing. And some people call it trickle truth or something like that. So I don't know if you can speak to how much the bishop that took his confession and was going through these sections actually knew about the full extent of his abuse. That's because I'm certain that when the law enforcement went in there, they saw something very different and much more depraved than what the bishop was exposed to. And number two, the difference that we're seeing in the types of institutional responses from a law enforcement agency who's been tipped off to a crime to the attorneys of the church. And you're seeing how fast, how rapid, how complete the investigation is from the people who are trained. It's their job to find these types of crimes and to hold people accountable. versus what the church is doing, which is let's keep things quiet, let's keep things, we don't want to make it, we don't want to cause a process. And one of those is defending victims and vulnerable people, and the other one is perpetuating abuse. So what can you speak to those 2 points?
Well, as far as how detailed did he go into his confession with the bishop? I think what we can say from the court documents is that he confessed to abusing and videotaping the abuse, and he confessed to doing it ongoingly. But what we don't necessarily know is we don't know like how graphic he got about that, right? Like, did he describe the sex acts? Did he tell the bishop he uploaded those videos to the internet? We don't know if he said that or not. Did he tell the bishop how many total videos that he had? We don't know if he said that. So,
but we've already crossed the threshold where the bishop knows that there's abuse and there's child pornography going on.
Yes,
so
that he definitely knew that. He definitely knew that.
Anything to add, Bill, in terms of the bishop experience?
Just the idea on systems in general, right? This isn't just a Mormon problem. We've seen lots of news come out of Jehovah's Witnesses, their religion. We've seen issues with Scientology and stuff in the past. And I think to a large extent, anytime a system claims to have authority that trumps the authority of the world, anytime a system has claims to have knowledge that trumps the knowledge of the world, and when the hierarchy, the higher up you go, those people say, look, I'm in charge and your job is to sustain and support me and to essentially act as though whatever I come up with, that's the way you move forward. You essentially support my position and act as if it's your own. You are setting up a culture for these kinds of things to happen. There's going to be creeps in the world. There are really sick people who do really sick things. But the problem that we can intervene quicker and stop or prevent or diminish is when systems perpetuate it because of the culture that stands within those systems.
Yeah. And I think that's where the church as an organization should be learning the lessons that all of these organizations are learning as they learn how to deal with this type of abuse. And, I don't think you can avoid the fact that in the past, institutions haven't been made aware of the extent and nature of this type of abuse and how to safeguard against it. But so much work has been done across the board, churches, scouts, other types of institutions, that there is a pattern of best practices and policies that these institutions should be adopting. And so the work that you're talking about, Ryan, highlighting where these failures are, should inform the church about how things need to change in the future. Where do you want to go from here on that?
Well, real quick, and maybe I don't know if you guys have other questions or not or whatever, but I would there's even more institutional failures in this story, unfortunately. And we touched on some of them in the article, but there was so much about this story that we could report on that there was so many details that you could only find in the court documents. So one of the things that we briefly touched on in the article is there was a family friend from their ward. Her name is, we named her in the article because she testified in the court proceedings. Last name was War. She was not only in their ward, but she was a co-worker of Paul Adams, the perpetrator. She was a Border Patrol agent herself. And she wasn't really friends with Paul Adams. In fact, she hated Paul Adams for the way he acted at work, which I'll get into in a second. But she had befriended the wife, Lisa, over the years because, she felt like she testified that she had this really, really, really strong suspicion that something was going on in the home. Now, she never knew, or she at least testifies that she never knew what exactly that was until after he was arrested. But her suspicions were so strong that she would constantly, over the course of several years, tell Lisa that she needed to leave Paul and that she would help her leave Paul. And Lisa would deflect and change the subject and whatever. And one of the reasons why, or there was a number of reasons why she had this distrust of Paul. One of them was how controlling she saw him as. Lisa wasn't allowed to go anywhere without him except for church. And also people were not allowed to come over to the house unless he was there, things like that. But even more disturbingly, he was disciplined at his work for two unbelievable things and still kept his job. And this behavior at work caused her to testify that she had mentally prepared herself to be able to pull a gun on Paul at any moment and shoot him. And what these things were, the first thing that Paul did as a Border Patrol agent that he was caught doing is he was sleeping with an undocumented immigrant and helping that undocumented immigrant smuggle drugs, using his car and things of this nature. And that the way he got caught was this woman who was working with him, I guess, got pulled over while driving his car, and of course they ran the registration and it came back to him, right? And that's how that kind of got blown up. And
that's not a fireable offense for an ICE agent.
Apparently it's not, because he got put on what was called light duty because of that. And I don't know what light duty is, but he got essentially somewhat reassigned. Maybe he wasn't in contact with the immigrants as much. I don't know. But the other thing that he did after that, so he gets disciplined for this, right? Then he makes terroristic threats against the Border Patrol. And apparently she describes what that meant. And apparently he would often just lose his temper over little things and get mad at people and start yelling and berating coworkers. And he would say, I'm going to blow this place up. But it got to the point where people thought he might be serious. And I guess some coworker of his reported it. They investigated, and he got another sort of reassignment or something, but he still kept his job. I mean, when they arrested him, all that stuff had already happened, and he was at work when they arrested him. So, but anyway, it was because of this erratic and dangerous behavior that she observed at work, plus the fact that she felt that there was something off at the home every time she saw the kids and the wife and all this stuff, that she had this suspicion. And, there's an argument, the lawyer of the kids who I interviewed for this story, and I indicated that the lawyer seems to want to make an argument that even that woman, as a Border Patrol agent, as a peace officer, had a duty to report. And I looked at the Arizona law, and she is a mandatory reporter based on the Arizona law. But she doesn't, we don't have any evidence that she knew about the abuse. But the way the law words, it says, if any of these list of people that are mandatory reporters have a reasonable belief that abuse is occurring, and then they list all these different types of abuse. And so the argument would be, is what constitutes reasonable belief? And I think the attorney, I don't want to speak for her, but based on the interview, I got the impression that the attorney's argument is that if her suspicion was so strong that she was, over the course of several years, encouraging this woman to leave her husband, that constitutes a reasonable belief and she should have reported it. That, I suppose, is up for debate. But that's another sort of aspect of this case that is just, it's wild. It's wild.
Yeah. I want to talk a little bit about the mixed obligations that Mormon bishops in particular may have. And Mormonism is a little bit different from other churches because we have a lay clergy in Mormonism. And what that means is that you're going to have people who are professionals in other arenas called to also be clergy members. And so that's where we've seen, when I read that this was a physician, that was like a huge shock to me initially for a couple of reasons. Number one is that as physicians, we all go through training. We all understand when you get licensed, you have to answer some questions, that it's made very clear to you that you are an obligated reporter of abuse of the elderly or of children. And so it doesn't matter what aspect of your life you come across that. If you're, at school at a kid's event and you find something that gives you reasonable suspicion, you are obligated to report that. And so what happens then when you're also a clergy member? So now you've got an exemption and an obligation. And I think this is where any church leader who's also a professional, who understands that if they fail their obligation according to their professional duty, they may lose their licensing. It affects their income. All of this would they'd be able to put up a defense if it ever came to it. But you as an individual have to decide whether you're going to side with defending an institutional church or defending potential victims. And
I've talked to a number of attorneys about this exact issue, not just on this story, but other similar stories that I've investigated. And, based on the conversations I've had with other attorneys who specialize in this type of law, they all tell me the same thing. And that is, what you said is true. A physician has to report, not just if he finds out about it at the doctor's office, but if he finds out his neighbor is doing something, he has to report. However, when they have another hat that they sometimes wear, like bishop, if they learn of that abuse while wearing that hat specifically, like through a confession, where in that moment they are not a physician, they are a bishop first, then the laws governing that hat supersede. Okay. Now they don't supersede if he finds out about his neighbor, right? Because when he's at home, he's really neither a physician or a bishop, right? And so the fact that he's a physician at work, would come into play. But that's what attorneys tell me is the case. I don't know if there's any cases where that has been sort of adjudicated or challenged. Maybe this will be one. I don't know. I mean, I don't know if they can try to take this guy's license away. But yeah, there's a really weird dynamic there. And I don't know if the law is super clear on which rule supersedes, but attorneys have told me that in practice, that's how the courts typically view these things. You heard about the abuse within your capacity as a bishop, therefore the rules governing clergy apply.
Yeah, well, you can look at different things that the church has done in other cases. And so the question comes up, if you as a physician or as a bishop, regardless of your position, see a case of abuse and the attorneys say, well, your state does not require you to report it, so don't report it, you still have the option of reporting it. You're not going to get in trouble. You haven't broken the law if you've reported it. All you've done is tried to help safeguard potential future victims. And so the thing that I've seen in my discussions with faithful members is that they just rest their hat on, the law doesn't require them to report it. But there's a difference between what is illegal and what is right. And that's really where that comes into stark contrast.
It probably should be noted here, guys. I was a floor covering salesman for 16 years, and it was during that time while working in that job, I dropped out of college. I didn't have a professional education. I wasn't in a career where I was taught ethics or certain safe boundaries. And then I'm called to be a bishop, and I served for almost 5 years. The training that I received was minuscule, if not almost absent. My awareness of how all these kinds of issues play out in real time, clueless to them. And as I sat as a bishop and dealt with some of these kinds of issues, I had no idea how to do any of this. I had no idea how to do any of these things that come across the plate. And so when we look at the church as a whole, yeah, I mean, sure, there's doctors called as bishops and stake presidents. There's other people in the medical profession, other kinds of professions that have to understand and are trained to deal with these kinds of things, social services and the like. But the reality is, too, there's lots of plumbers and electricians. There are lots of accountants. There are lots of professions where nobody has ever been trained outside of church. And then there's no training inside church to deal with these issues either. And man, it gets messy. I'll tell you, I dealt with a little bit of this as a bishop. It just scared the hell out of me because I didn't know what I was supposed to do.
And it makes sense that people who don't receive training then just defer all of the decisions to the church. And the assumption is that the church then is going to be held responsible for anything. But when you go back and you look at the history of how the church has handled dealing with these abuse cases when they eventually go to court, in many cases, the very bishops that are involved in it may be called to testify because they are involved in how things were discovered. And there's a case in Arizona in particular that comes to mind where they wanted to call the bishop and the stake president because they had information about the crime, and the church blocked it. The attorneys would not allow them, and they claimed this penitent privilege. But because the abuser had already confessed to police, and that was how it was originally made known, there was the argument that privilege no longer existed. And they fought it all the way to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court ended up saying, no, those bishop and stake president are obligated to testify, and that immediately made the church increase the amount of settlement that they were willing to go through. And so they were able to pay the families of the victims money in order to avoid going to trial and having the policies and the procedures of the church be subject to public scrutiny. You can read an amicus brief that the church published for the courts who were dealing with a different religion on the issue of child abuse. And I have this, it's one of the images on the Thoughts on Things and Stuff Facebook group. And you can see the arguments that the church makes in order to avoid this. And one of them is that we can't have clergy member sacrifice their duty to the entire congregation in order to help one victim, which is, when you think about it, Christ's parable of leaving the flock to go after the one, to help the one victim, is exactly what a Christian church is supposed to do. But the church uses that as an argument that they can't allow the breaking of that penitent privilege.
And it should be noted just really quick, and then I'll let you talk, Ryan. We should at least be aware, the victims get to decide whether they accept the settlements or not. And I honor whatever choice they make, whether to proceed with a case, because there's tons of issues that come into play about how hard it is to resolve these cases without running out of money first. So I understand that. But I also want to add in as a caveat that no amount of money erases the trauma that's done and the ripples of that trauma generation after generation after these initial events happen.
Yeah, I am always bewildered when I read these things about how the church has an opportunity staring them in the face where every single person in the world would stand up and clap if they simply said, if you come and tell us that you robbed the Walmart last night, we'll go ahead and keep that one quiet for you. We'll let you confess that one. But if you confess to abusing children, that one's no longer on the table. We're going to report it. That's our new policy, everybody. So be on warning. Everybody would stand up and cheer. I don't understand. This is such an easy one. And they do report, like in state. It's not like they
right.
It's not like Mormons can say, well, this is like a doctrine that we can't bend on and it's a fundamental belief. No, because they do report in states that require it. They do.
There are other churches that hold the position that the penitent privilege is doctrinal and foundational and a core part of their religion. I think Episcopalians is one of those. And so they put up a much stronger things. But the church's position has always been, even in cases where, it's their advice of their attorneys to the bishops is not a commandment. The bishops still have autonomy to do that, and they're not violating any church privilege. It's just that members are so programmed to follow authority that is what happens, and the church benefits from it.
Well, luckily, if we've learned anything from the church, they don't do anything, whether it's right or wrong, until the people essentially demand it. And I don't know if you guys saw, there was a Tribune article earlier this week. It might have been Wednesday, I think, that was some poll results on, it was Utah specific, I believe.
Yeah.
And it was like people's support of this proposed bill they have up in Utah, proposed by Angela, who is not a Mormon, by the way, that to remove the clergy exemption that exists in Utah, and they broke up the poll by like religious affiliation and everything, and basically across the board, including active LDS, like over 70% of respondents support removing this privilege. So the members want this. Most members, if you read comments, a lot of members already think the church reports. They don't realize that the church doesn't always report. So like they need to get their act together. I hope maybe this article can help move that needle a little bit because of how bad it is. And like, this is one of these ones where you can't, I don't think an apologist could spin this particular story in any way of why the church was okay with doing what they did. And so maybe this helps, get Angela Romero over whatever humps she's trying to get over to get that law passed. I think that if in Utah, where the bulk of active Mormons in the world live, if it changes there, I think we have a decent chance for them to maybe just go ahead and change the policy worldwide. Hopefully. I mean, that's my speculation.
Yeah. Well, it's really because of the type of journalism that you're doing that you're going to educate people about the deficiencies that exist in the current policies. So I really appreciate you guys doing the work that you do and encourage you to keep it up. Anything that we should be looking out for in the future?
We've got a bunch of stories in the pipeline. We don't tease stories, so I can't really tell you what they are, but I mean, we're definitely back in business and stories and hopefully a podcast here in the next couple of months. And keep interacting with us online or other people that do similar work and keep the conversation going and just keep increasing the awareness about these issues.
Yeah. If people have things that they think may be relevant to the work that you're doing, how do they reach y'all?
They can go to our website, truthandtransparency.org, and contact us, either submit through the portal or they can just email us. Our emails are on there. You can send me a message on Facebook. You can, my contact information is pretty much out there. We have a phone number on the website you can call. I'm happy to listen to anybody that has something to tell me. I can't guarantee it would be a story, but I'm happy to hear you out. So.
All right. Well, Ryan, we're going to let you go about your day. Thank you so much for taking the time to share a little bit about what you're doing.
All right. See you later, guys.
Take care.
I know Ryan isn't going to, plug himself in this way, but what a great entity to try and shine a light on some of the unhealthiness that happens out there within certain systems, specifically religious systems. I know that in the past, financially, the Truth and Transparency Foundation, as well as Mormon Leaks, when it was under that name, certainly donations and other kinds of ways of supporting such an entity. I just kind of throw that out maybe as a thought.
Yeah. I think particularly when you have the types of institutions that we have that are so insular and protective and secretive, that's really when you need these outlets for people to be able to report things without the fear of reprisal or consequences. And all of the institutions have it. In the military, when I was there, they have their own inspector general thing where if you see something that's wrong, you have a way to channel that's not directly subject to the type of discipline that may prevent people from reporting abuses otherwise.
I've called Ryan on probably a handful of occasions, maybe 4 or 5 times, with some little tidbit of something that I had kind of caught down the pipeline, heard about, and Ryan always calls back immediately. So it's if somebody's got something, certainly reach out to them.